to an extent, it depends on the job. But yeah, like should meet like, where if the workers are remote, then management can and should be remote, and HR can and should be remote. Likewise hybrid, likewise in person. But I'd double down on my comment of there are a lot of mature established organizations that are resisting remote work that I think will be forced more and more in that direction from a talent attraction and retention perspective.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, and this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. It has become a cliche to say that the last few years have brought unprecedented change to how we do business. A worldwide pandemic, supply chain breakdowns, learning to work from home, and then in many cases, negotiating the return to the office. It's been stressful. And it will be no surprise to my listeners that much of that stress in the workplace has found its way to the HR department. And HR people are done, y'all. I hear it from HR reps all the way up to senior executives. The burnout is real. To discuss with me how HR professionals can maintain their sanity, regain the love of what they do, and engage to move their organizations forward, I'm joined by Andrew Bartlow. Andrew leads Series B Consulting, which helps businesses to articulate their people strategy and accelerate their growth while navigating rapid change. He also founded the People Leader Accelerator, a leadership development program for startup HR leaders. He's also the co-author of Scaling for Success, People Priorities for High-Growth Organizations. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Andrew.
Mike, thank you. Really good to be here with you.
So, a global pandemic, work from home, the racial reckoning, the Great Resignation, 9% inflation. All of these things fell right into HR's lap, one after the other. Is it any wonder that many people leaders feel like all they've done for the last 2.5 years is react?
It's the perfect storm, both in business as well as for the HR profession. Absolutely. On the other hand, I think it's also the golden age of human resources, where all of these events and issues occurring at the same time make the human resources profession really step forward to be shown to be, one of the leaders in helping organizations move through these complicated times.
Right. I've been in HR as long as you have, and throughout my career, I've heard the steady drumbeat of, I want a seat at the table. Why don't they give HR a seat at the table? Blah, blah, blah. And I've always argued you earn your seat at the table, and by showing value and understanding the business and how your people programs lead to the success of the business. But I think most of the people who weren't ready for that seat at the table got run over the last few years. I mean, we were expected to be medical experts, and then Congress passed a whole bunch of laws, and we had to become experts in these new laws, and while the ink was still wet. And then we've had the Great Resignation, all of this stuff. So I think it is a great opportunity, but I think a lot of HR folks are still, and a lot of business leaders in general, are still struggling with the rapid pace of change and trying to determine what's next, and spending so much time worrying about what's next that they're not managing what they've got right in front of them. What would you tell a business leader, HR or otherwise, about business planning in this environment?
Well, I think it starts with have a plan. In this environment, even with so much happening around us, so many extraneous, distracting, major events in the zeitgeist happening, start with have a plan. What is your business plan? What is your people plan? And ensure that you're continuing to make progress towards it, even with all of these headwinds and challenges that we're facing. So, have a plan and don't get don't get overly distracted by what's happening around us. Be ready to pivot, be ready to tack as needed, but stick with your core goals and ensure that you don't lose sight of them.
So when our circumstances are constantly changing, and and as they have been, and how do you how do you tell your clients when you're working with them to maintain focus on that plan while it seems like there's so much uncertainty that maybe there wasn't 6 months ago around that plan?
Yeah, well, hey, I'd start with just having the plan puts you in the upper decile of organizations. Most organizations have all hands meetings, have investor pitch decks, have board meeting decks. Very few top HR leaders have a documented people plan. What are the 3 or so most important things that we're going to work on, and what are the small handful of projects and initiatives that will support those few most important things? So, I'm going to triple down on this. It starts with having a plan, and that plan should be connected to what is the business trying to accomplish, right? And so if you have that simple plan, and I'm not talking about a 100-page McKinsey or Bain strategy deck, I'm talking about a one-pager that might look like an org chart with your company goals at the very top, and then your HR priorities supporting those company goals. Think of it like a waterfall. Just having that one pager to provide the clarity and alignment that your organization needs will put you in the top 10% of any organization. And then as circumstances change, it can become pretty easy to swap out an initiative or a goal as needed. But heck, start with the plan and write it down, and that'll help you ensure that there's clarity and alignment throughout your organization.
Yeah, so as a people leader, whether it's the smaller business and the owner is really running that show, or it's a larger company and HR is running the people function, what are the 2 or 3 things you think should be in that plan? I mean, certainly the company has goals and plans, and we're going to work to execute those. But what are the 2 or 3 things that the people leader really needs to focus in on and consider as they plan, as they do their people planning?
Sure. Well, hey, I would once again start with the organizational goals. If the planning is done in a vacuum, if HR is coming up with its plans to do HR things that are not directly connected to the most important things for that organization, that's where we get put in a corner. You might still be at a table, but you'll be at the little table in the corner in the same room. So our goals and priorities in HR must be directly and clearly linked to the most important goals and priorities for the organization. Otherwise, we're not meeting our full potential. Otherwise, we're not strategic operators. We're service providers, and that won't help us meet our full potential. So it starts with aligning our goals to the organization's goals. So what are likely to be the organization's goals in this case? One, we're always trying to increase revenue at just about any organization we're a part of, right? Two, we're probably trying to decrease cost, right? Lots of layoffs in today's environment. Lots of high growth companies aren't as high growth as they were a few months ago. So controlling cost, increasing revenue. Maybe there's something else. Maybe there's expansion into Europe. Maybe there's supporting a new product line. Whatever it is. So figure out what those few most important things are for your organization, and then tie those HR priorities to it. So if it's controlling cost, maybe there's some evaluation of your workforce planning. How many people do we need doing what, when, and maybe where? Where is less relevant nowadays, but understanding what's often 80% of an organization's total cost is its headcount. So how many people do we really need where, doing what? That's important. So, figure out what your pipeline looks like, how many people you think you're going to need to hire, how many people you think you might need to lay off. That will help you get a handle on your costs. And revenue, how are you going to generate that revenue? What's the HR team doing to support your sales and marketing and business development teams? Um, all organizations, all functions are not necessarily equal. If you're trying to drive revenue, maybe you want to put extra attention, extra focus, extra resources, dedicate a few projects towards helping the front end revenue generating part of the business versus customer success, operations, G&A departments. Is it fair? No. Will it help your organization meet its goals? Yes. So my point once again is figure out what's most important for your organization and dedicate outsized, overweighted efforts towards accomplishing those things rather than some separate set of HR priorities.
You hear in many organizations, well, HR is a cost center, and I hear a lot of HR professionals say that, and we really don't contribute to revenue. We get the position recs, we fill them, we try to make sure people get their benefits, and we'll do our salary surveys, but none of that's revenue generating. What do you when you're talking about HR contributing to revenue generation? What kind of things are you talking about?
Sure. Well, I think you're right, and those people are right that HR does not directly sell something. We do not directly generate revenue. Um, Whatever we do has a cost in terms of headcount or soft cost in terms of time and attention from people that we're paying or vendor spend that we have. However, we are an enabling function. We can we have the potential to increase the productivity or the effectiveness of other departments. And so, what can we do to help your sales force be 5 or 10% more productive? What are the things that we could do? What are the things that we could do to help a new hire more quickly ramp up and onboard and be more successful and generate more revenue? So there are very specific programs and initiatives that human resources can design or implement that can directly contribute to revenue generation. We're an enabler, we're not a deliverer in those areas. But that's where a lot of HR organizations, often miss out. If we're bringing solutions that are searching for a problem, like, oh, I have this great survey tool or great performance management tool. Let's get an annual subscription to Lattice or Culture Amp or whatever. Hey, those are great tools, but do you really need that tool right now? What problem are you trying to solve? I'd suggest that we start at the top with it, which is the org goals, and then we decide what tools we need to use, rather than unfortunately we often have these bright shiny objects that we chase around looking for a problem to solve.
You work with a lot of startups and fast scaling companies, and they're constantly undergoing change. In fact, I've worked with them, and often from the first time I meet founders to the next time I talked to them 3 months ago, they're in a different business altogether. I mean, it's just and some of those are pretty large pivots as they figure out what the marketplace really needs and how receptive it is. But what can HR leaders in more traditionally stable companies learn from who are the stable companies are now facing constant change? It's the last 2 or 3 years have really proven that. What can they learn from a startup experience?
I like to think that enterprise mature organizations know what good looks like, know what high quality execution and implementation look like. And startups know what fast feels like. So, to your question, more mature organizations can learn from that pace and from that ability to pivot in different market dynamics. And so right now we are in a time of change, the great resignation, the great reshuffling, what do you call it, that remote work. So many more stable, more mature, more established organizations are continuing to resist these changes rather than embracing them and pivoting. And so that's a big opportunity for bigger organizations, is to figure out what's likely to stay with us or ride the wave of decreased cost due to less commercial office space, of lower labor costs due to geographic arbitrage. You don't have to hire people in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live. You can go hire them in Atlanta and sometimes pay half the cost.
Or
Why
Mexico
wouldn't you?
City.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Well, just even the, geographic arbitrage inside the United States can be dramatic. You don't have
Mhm.
to go to another country or deal with, new time zones and new languages. So, remote work has tremendous possibilities that I've seen a lot of established organizations continue to resist.
Yeah, let's talk about that because in a lot of my conversations with HR folks at conferences or online, a lot of them are demanding, especially managers and lower, and more frontline HR folks are demanding to work from home, uh, just like the rest of the employees are. And I keep making the argument that that's a big mistake for an HR department. That if you've got operations that are in, especially if you've got a production environment where people are having to come in, but if your leadership, the rest of the leadership team is in there, HR needs to be there. That's the only way you're keeping your pulse on the organization. If the organization's in the building, if the leadership's and the decisions are being made and the conversations are being had, I think HR needs to be there. And maybe you work, hybrid or something like that. But HR, to stay plugged in, you've got to build those connections, and you're going to do that better if you're face to face. Now, I'm a big believer in remote. I mean, I'm an all remote company, and we bend over backwards to make sure that we're in constant conversation with one another. We've got one to ones, and we use video and everything else. But I think if in a large organization, if your customers as HR, which is your leadership and your strategy makers, are in the building, HR needs to be there. Give me your feedback on that.
Yeah, I think at a high level, I agree, but like in many things, there's some nuance. So it depends on the role. If you are focused as a HR generalist doing program rollout and policy interpretation and employee relations investigations, absolutely there's greater value in being where your workers are. If your if your frontline workers are in a physical location and your leadership is in a physical location, then HR, without a doubt, should generally be in that same physical location. Like don't set the example in the wrong direction by being the only people out of the building. But there's some jobs that don't need to be there, right? Maybe you're at scale and you have a uh, you know call center customer service group that handles some benefits changes. Do they need to physically be in the building, or could their work be transacted just fine over phone, email, video? Sure. Payroll. Do you really want anybody walking over to payroll's desk and looking over their shoulder asking them questions? Probably not. So I'd say to an extent, it depends on the job. Um, but yeah, like should meet like, where if the workers are remote, then management can and should be remote, and HR can and should be remote. Likewise, hybrid, likewise in person. Um, but I'd double down on my comment of there are a lot of mature, established organizations that are resisting remote work that I think will be forced more and more in that direction from a talent attraction and retention perspective. Would you rather be sourcing for these hard to fill jobs from just the 30-mile radius around your physical office that you pay a heck of a lot of money for? Or would you like to source worldwide or nationwide and potentially pay less, both in terms of office rent as well as in terms of base pay, by finding talent in lower cost of labor areas? So it'll become a no-brainer, but we're continuing to see the resistance.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, premium background checks with fast and friendly service. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Recert Credits. Then select episode 55 and enter the keyword Bartlow. That's Bartlow. And if you're looking for even more recertification credit, check out the webinars page at imperativeinfo.com. I have 10 hours of recorded webinars, each approved for an hour of recertification credit by both HRCI and SHRM. 3 are even approved for HRCI business credit, and 1 qualifies for ethics credit. You can access all of these webinars for free at imperativeinfo.com. And now back to my conversation with Andrew Bartlow. And so I think what you were basically saying is a pushback to what my position was really the transactional HR folks can probably be offsite, but the more strategic, the planning, the development folks need to be wherever their leaders are and wherever the rest of the organization is. And so if the leaders are there on site, and then certainly the HR planners need to be there as well.
If you're the head of the HR function and all the other senior leaders are in one place and you're not there, you're not at the table any longer.
Yeah, you got to be in the room, actually show up physically in the room to
Right.
be, to sit at that table.
That's right.
And I think you make a really good point about work from home, not just as a talent attraction for your local talent pool, but a talent expansion, as expanding that talent pool out beyond, especially if you're in Silicon Valley or in New York City or any of the major, more expensive metropolitan areas. I think, I know, especially software developers, folks they're moving to the country. I mean, they know, the best ones know they can work anywhere. And so if you're stuck with the people who are forced, the talent that's forced to come into the office, you may not be getting the best talent available in the next 2 or 3 years. What do you think that the average workplace is going to look like in 3 years after this is all settled, and this remote work, hybrid work, and all of that? What's your prediction for the expectations of job seekers and what employers are going to have to do to match those expectations?
Well, I think I'd start with it won't be settled in the next 2 or 3 years. It'll continue to work itself out. I think there will be a continuing trend towards more remote, more hybrid over time as companies figure it out and their long-term commercial office leases expire.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I do not want to be in commercial real estate in about 18 months. So,
I wouldn't want to be there now.
Yeah.
Although I know plenty of people who are and continue to do just fine, there should be reduced need. Now that said, there's likelihood that office space will be considered a perk moving forward. So not everyone has space in their home in the suburbs to have a home office. A lot of people can and do benefit from having dedicated workspace with a good private spot to do work from in a focused way. So potentially there is the rebirth of a WeWork like world where there are miniature hubs, that are spaced around the country or around the world. I've seen more and more of that start to take place. I've also seen a trend towards intentional gathering spaces. General Electric back in the day had Crotonville. Washington Mutual had Cedarbrook. Salesforce just invested in a big new campus in among the redwoods in Southern California called the 1440 University. And these are corporate meeting centers where people who may be living wherever come together for learning, for training, for meetings, for gatherings, and intentionally build relationships. Does that need to be in an office that you go to 5 days a week? No. That leaves a lot of people out that are working remotely. But can you invest some of those dollars, actually far fewer of those dollars, to reserve far less space, and instead of paying Hilton, Hyatt, and Marriott for your conference space, you get a dedicated space for your organization that has your history and your artifacts there, where people can come together and rub elbows in the hallway or break bread together. I think there will be more and more of that type of corporate center activity that doesn't necessarily need to be in some downtown location that people commute to every day.
You talked about how comp is going to be affected by the ability to, not have to hire somebody in Silicon Valley. I can hire somebody in Ohio or wherever. What's that going to do to the workforce in Silicon Valley and in these other places where people already, have set down roots and it's expensive to live there? And we're seeing, I'm in Texas, pew pew. So we're seeing all you Californians moving here, and in fact, I think U-Haul will almost pay you to drive a U-Haul from Texas to California because they can't keep them there. But with that happening, what do you think that's going to do to workforce, to the workforces that those folks who have roots in those more expensive locations?
Well, I think the people with roots will stay rooted, and the people that can move will move. Why wouldn't you move if housing is 70% less between the Bay Area and major metros in Texas? Why wouldn't you move if state taxes are 15% in California and 0% in Texas, Tennessee, and Florida? Um, it's happening. I would myself. I'd love to move. I have two little girls here and an ex that I'm not going to move away from though. But boy, I'm already planning my move once they're out of high school.
Yeah, 10 years ago, I put a 10-year plan in place for when my last kid graduates high school, which was about 2 months ago. And it's wheels up starting this fall for me and my wife. So I'll just tell you, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And I don't think empty nester syndrome is going to affect us negatively at all.
Yeah.
But so right now, inflation's at 9%. Wages are really there's a lot of wage pressure to push that up. But what do you tell a company that says, we know this inflation's temporary, and I know that if I lock in, if I change my salary bands and start bringing people on board at these higher, wages that they're demanding right now, I'm just screwing myself a year down the road, 2 years down the road, when we're not facing this pressure. Because most business leaders have never been through this kind of inflation. They didn't grow up in the 70s and 80s. And so what are you telling your clients as you have conversations around comp and inflation?
Yeah, I've had more than a few of those recently. Inflation is similar to cost of living. Cost of living is different than cost of labor. So you think of cost of living increases versus base pay increases. It's basically only unions and the government or government unions that look at COLA
Right.
increases. Otherwise, you're looking at cost of labor benchmarking and market pricing. And the data that I've seen from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and World at Work does a nice job. It's a compensation professional association of pulling some of that together. I've read a couple of different articles that even though inflation is bumping around 9% at the moment, a lot of that is driven by energy. Much of the core housing data, although housing prices have gone way up, housing has not moved by 9% in terms of actual real cost. And the cost of compensation is up around 4.1%, which is quite a bit higher than it had been in prior years, but it's nowhere near 9%. So I'd suggest that most organizations want to stay competitive, and that means continue to be competitive against other organizations that have similar jobs. You're not trying to compete with inflation and cost of living. You're trying to compete with cost of labor. So continue to benchmark, continue to market price, keep an eye on how wages are moving. But why would any organization want to get too far out in front of that? And so there may be an educational opportunity for workers that talk about how much inflation is going up, but ultimately it doesn't serve an employer to pay more than they have to attract and retain the workers that they need.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that a lot of employees don't get is a fair wage isn't a magic number. It's the fair wage is what you agree to come work for.
Yes,
And the day you don't think you're getting paid fairly, go find another job that'll pay you better for the same work and
yes.
or do different kind of work. And I think a lot of, especially my business owner friends, have a hard because they want to do the right thing and they want to feel virtuous in how they relate to their employees. And I think that's all great. But at the end of the day, your labor cost is your one of your most significant costs and most for most businesses, and either you raise prices to cover the your wages, or you make your people a lot more productive, and that's sometimes the better investment. Find more productive people, and don't let them don't let your employees get too bogged down in in their own security, I guess, and let there be a little pressure makes diamonds, and so let there be some of that.
The ugly truth about compensation is you'll never get a better raise than by changing companies.
Yeah,
Right? When you go through a job change or an employer change, it's typically a 15 to 20% increase. A good raise at a current employer is 5%. String two or three of those together, and it's massively to a worker's benefit to change employers. Of course, mitigated by trying to be aware of what your resume looks like and how choppy is it, how much of a job hopper are you, could that affect you in your ability to get the next job. In some parts of the country, that's an issue. In other parts of the country, it's not odd whatsoever to see people with a new job every 15 months.
I think a lot of folks jump for money and land thinking the grass is going to be greener, and they're in a worse situation. They're less satisfied with their working circumstances, and I think during the Great Resignation, I know that I've talked to plenty of folks who thought they were moving to a better deal just because there was an extra zero at the end of their paycheck. But once they got there, they realized there's a reason this company has to pay for this, this kind of talent, pay this for that kind of talent. And so, but if I think we're probably already in a recession, just we just don't know it yet. But what is your advice to employers who are trying to do their workforce planning, looking down the road? Okay, we've got this plan. This is where we thought revenue was going to be. We've got all this inflation driving all our costs, but we think a recession is coming. We don't know necessarily when, and usually, unless you're one of the canary in the coal mine industries, you find out a little later than you want to. What's your advice about how you plan your workforce, your workforce population, the skills and talents you need when a recession may be coming?
Yeah, I think basic scenario planning is appropriate in any sort of budgeting process, both financial and headcount budgeting. So what's base case? What could good look like? And what could, in this case, recessionary revenue look like with demand down? So maybe you don't have a good case. Maybe you just have two versions of bad case in this scenario. Like what's your base plan, and then C and D for you. But I think if you do some basic scenario planning, you let demand shape revenue and ensure that costs are paired up with that, you can get a handle on what your workforce can and should look like. Whether you're an employer of 20 people or 2,200, that's probably something simple. Again, it doesn't need to be a 6-month exercise that has outside consultants do it. Just do some basic headcount and cost planning so that you aren't reactionary and grinding away with repeated reductions in force
Right.
as potentially negative activities happen.
And I think that goes HR's role, and that goes back to that understanding the business and what the key metrics that drive the business are, and if you don't know what those metrics are, if you don't know what the canary in the coal mines are, what are those early indicators, those leading indicators that things may be shifting. It's how can you as HR help your leadership predict anything else if you don't do that? And I think we've still got too many HR folks who know HR, they just don't know their business and how the company makes money, and will hopefully continue to in the future.
Your best friend as an HR professional, or especially an HR business partner, should be the FP&A lead for your group. FP&A, of course, stands for financial planning and analysis. That's who typically runs the budgets. If you're not doing the headcount planning, they're doing it for you and may or may not be involving you in the process. If you're at a smaller organization that doesn't have a dedicated FP&A function, it's probably somewhere in your finance department. But your best friend should be in finance, in HR, and be curious. Ask the questions. What are the drivers? If you don't learn these things, you won't be a well-rounded, successful, strategic HR leader.
Well, thanks for that. Thank you for joining me today, Andrew. That's all the time we have, but it was a great conversation.
Thank you, Mike.
And thank you for listening. You can find previous episodes, show notes, and contact info for our guest at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcast. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.